You're watching Lunchtime Agenda. We've just had this speech, pre-budget speech from the Prime Minister Tony Abbott, and here to talk a bit about that and, of course, what we're expecting generally in the budget. I have with me here in the studio Labor's Deborah and, of course, also from the National Party, Matthew Canavan.
Hey, Tom.
Let's start, first of all, on superannuation. The PM there again indicated that Labor is planning to tax super. We don't plan any more taxes. Nothing will happen before the election. Long term, though, is it something that will need to be looked at and perhaps taken to the election?
Well, Tom, we made a commitment the last election not to touch superannuation. As a young person myself, I get very frustrated at governments continually messing with the superannuation system, because the money that I and others in my generation put into superannuation today, we won't access for something like 40, 30, 40, 50 years, some of us. And, you know, you get really worried when governments continue to tinker with it. Because they've effectively got your money for that period of time. And if they continue doing that, it's going to undermine support for the system and undermine support for putting more into super than perhaps is currently compulsory required to. So I think it's time to have a bit of a pause and take a breath before we make more changes.
Even if Peter Costello perhaps made some too generous concessions that need to be wound back, you keep it in place even if you think it's unsustainable just for that continuity.
I think continuity is a very important issue in this system. Yes, the former Howard government did make a lot of changes to superannuation over its life. In its first budget, it increased the contribution tax on superannuation contributions from 15% to 30% for income earners over $85,000. And then later on there was some more concessions provided. But I do think, given all the change we've had in the past 15 to 20 years, it's time to take a pause. Okay. We have a good superannuation system. Let's settle down before we make any more major changes.
Deborah, the mining tax, the Prime Minister has just said Labor had $17 billion of spending locked into that, and on current trajectories, we're hearing all about the iron ore price. It wouldn't raise a cent. It's true, isn't it?
It was always designed to be a tax that was going to make the best of Australia's profit when we were making the most, and not to have an impact on businesses as it went into this natural part of a downturn in the cycle. So, you know, it was flexible in that way.
But not flexible in locking in the spending.
Exactly.
Well, look, let's just think about the reaction of the government to this issue and a number of other issues, and I'd like to make some comments about the superannuation, which we've just dealt with. You know, Labor's the party that started superannuation. The Liberal Party and the coalition at the time said it couldn't even be delivered and couldn't be developed. Now we have a $1.8 trillion industry that, you know, Senator Canavan has indicated certainly was moved around in many, many different ways during the Costello years. Right now, we actually have an opportunity to make sure that superannuation moving into the future is an advantage to all Australians. We went to the last election saying that we would change tax for at the very, very top. People with over $2 million, you know, who were going to stand to make a lot of money out of it.
At the same time, though, I mean, Kevin Rudd, before he came to power, he wouldn't change it. Then he wanted to make changes, so there's a bit on both sides, I guess. I'm going to keep it brief because we don't have too long. Matthew Canavan, when it comes to the PM saying a lot of the heavy lifting had been done in the first budget, one thing he doesn't mention, but a key part of spending being reined in for the federal government, is reducing the trajectory of spending for health and education. I know there's debate about 30, 50, whether it is the 80 billion or not, because some of it is beyond forward estimates. But that's the biggest chunk of change structurally, isn't it? But not something often boasted about, if you like.
Oh, well, I think the budget last year was upfront about that it did reduce payments to the state governments. We have to.
It doesn't make it in stump speeches, though, does it?
Well, look, obviously we're focused on the here and now, Tom, and the budget that is delivered every year is a budget for the next financial year, not for the next 10 or 20 years. It has some projections and estimates for a 4-year period in the budget. But clearly, there's only two options here. There's only two options. We can continue on the former path, which would have led to, in 40 years' time, debt to GDP of $144,000 per person. Now, I don't want, and I'll hopefully still be alive then. I don't want to have to owe $144,000 per person.
It's a strange assumption,
now,
isn't
at the moment,
just to jump in, because that assumes basically Labor is in power for 40 years and doesn't do a thing about just keep spending exactly as is for 40 years.
Well, I reckon Labor would do that if they were in power for 40 years' time. I think the history shows they do that. They continue to spend more and more money. I mean, a few years ago, Labor tried to balance the budget in 2010-11. Wayne Swan put down a budget saying he would deliver a surplus 3 years early, ahead of every other economy.
And when are
well.
you going to
and
develop
hang on,
a
hear me out.
surplus?
You
When
know how
is
much
it
they
even
cut
on the
spending? You know how much
horizon?
they cut spending on that budget? Zero. There were spending increases in that budget. The only reason they were saying they were able to project they could balance the budget was because they increased taxes, primarily the mining tax. And guess how that worked out? They didn't raise any money from the mining tax.
They raised
and even
a small
now,
amount of money, but not as much
well,
as
I think after compliance costs,
$200 million
it probably was a net cost.
Deborah, I'll let you respond, but I'd like to ask you as well about pensions, because this is something the government says it wants to make more sustainable. Do you think, at least with tightening eligibility rules, you can spend less on pensions, keep the full pension, as Labor's been saying, but Bill Shorten seems to be almost saying no money at all out of this system? Is that what you think should happen?
Before the ballot that led to the election of this government, there was one set of language around surplus. That's rolled back. There were going to be no cuts to health, no changes to the pension. We've seen health cuts of $57 billion. And, you know, in the inquiry that we're running here through the Select Health Committee, we're seeing incredible devastation of health access for all Australians. They didn't tell anybody they were going to do that before they got in, and now we're seeing the consequences of that, including language around increased morbidity and mortality as a consequence of this government's decisions to cut funding.
How much does health spending change over the forward estimates, Senator O'Neill? Do you have that figure?
Because
it strikes me as
$57 billion
over the
that this government is taking out.
That's a 10-year figure that goes well beyond forward. So I will accept that 58 or the 80 billion, if you like, is a figure that's well beyond actual any spending that was locked in. But do you accept that there has been, you said there has been this rein-in of spending, and the states are sort of, what's going to happen on Friday at COAG? It's going to be a bit of a squabble.
Well, look, Tom, the important thing here is that there has not been cuts to health spending over the forward estimates. Now, Senator O'Neill talks about it already having impact. It strikes me, well, provide a figure, because the $57 billion figure is transfers to states. It's not identified as health spending per se, and that's up to the states how they deal with that. Now, one thing we really have to do at COAG, you spoke about COAG, Tom. One thing we have dropped the ball on in this country in the last 10 years is proper reform of health and education. The former Rudd government tried to do a bit with hospitals, but failed, and we have to, going forward, make sure that we spend money in these sectors more efficiently. Now, it's not about getting lower services or fewer outcomes for people, but it's about making our bucks, our dollars, our tax dollars that everyone pays for, stretch further. We've done that in some areas of health like the prescription benefit scheme. We need to continue that with hospitals and other areas as well, or otherwise we're going to end up with massive amounts of debt. And
the problem is, though, that the cuts that have been made have not been made based on evidence. They've been made based on ideology. And we've heard this morning that although there's been much talk about taking the GP co-payment off the table, sitting right beside it is a price signal, and today we've had evidence that says that's exactly the same thing. So people need to be very, very aware. This is an incompetent and dishonest government that has misled them.
We're just about out of time, but very quickly, Labor appears, you were just saying before, when are you going to deliver a surplus? Do you think Labor can run a successful campaign asking about surpluses given the Rudd-Gillard years?
Well, absolutely, absolutely.
Even though that they said we'll deliver one and it never even went close?
Look, the financial management of the Rudd-Gillard period of time, if you look to the international evidence rather than the hyperbolic conversation that's often a part of the discussion here in the country, saw a government that delivered very, very good economic outcomes for this country through the GFC.
Okay.
You know, we've got a government now that's claiming great economic credentials, but it's got the highest level unemployment in 12 years, and it's absolutely drawn business
the international evidence, New
floor.
Zealand has a surplus. Canada's about to have a surplus.
But there's no one on the horizon under a hockey
we don't have a surplus of time, so we'll have to end it right here.
Thanks so much, Tom.
Deborah O'Neill, thanks for your time.
Thanks, Tom. Thanks, Deb.
Thanks, of course, for watching at home. Stay with us for Newsday coming up with Ash Gillen.